I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. It's good to be with all of you. I want to say a special hello to viewers that are watching this live on our blog at the New America Foundation or on my blog, thewashingtonnote.com, and also guests around the world who are watching now live on C-SPAN. It's very good to be with all of you. I'm excited about this program, and I want to say a few words about our speakers today. Walter Mead is along with Cheryl Schweninger, who of course runs our economic program and is sort of my alter ego in a lot of the foreign affairs work we do. But Walter Russell Mead, who's on the board of the New America Foundation, helped birth this institution many, many years ago. Over 10 years ago, in fact, he and Cheryl Schweninger got a grant to sort of think about the future of U.S. foreign policy and how to set a context of thinking ahead. They went out and found Ted Halstead, who's now sailing around the world quite pleasantly, I hear. But Walter Mead created the New America Foundation, deserves enormous credit, and I tell everyone who's angry at me for anything I might have done that it's Walter's fault. But we're endlessly grateful to Walter Mead for the leadership role he played in helping to create this interesting think tank that has, I think, succeeded beyond any of our hopes and aspirations from the very beginning. He has written an outstanding article that has just come out in the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs magazine, and I confirm that it is finally on Foreign Affairs website now. It's titled "Change They Can Believe In to Make Israel Safe, Give Palestinians Their Due." It is something that I thought we should take a look at, particularly from the man who more than anyone else helped Americans, particularly insider Washingtonians, begin to figure out where they fit within the schools of foreign policy thinking. How many of us used to walk around at parties and saying, are you a Jacksonian or are you a Wilsonian? Maybe I'm a Hamiltonian or a Jeffersonian. I was never a Jeffersonian, for those who are interested. In fact, I give this test to new interns and research associates who join New America and say, where are you on the Meade scale? Because it was in his book, Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, that Walter gave us, I think, an easy set of handles to ourselves think about contemporary foreign policy challenges, how we think about them. And I think Walter somewhat migrated at one point from being if I remember, a Jacksonian Hamiltonian to a Jacksonian Wilsonian. He can tell his own story, but I enjoyed this very much, and I think that at the time Special Providence was one of those books that really did catch fire here in Washington and helped us all think about and tell these stories. He has another new book, a paperback out now. This is not the cover of the paperback, but it's called God in Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, which I also commend to you. It was chosen by the Washington Post as one of the best historical books of the year this last year, as were a couple of other New America Foundation-related books. But I commend to you God in Gold. Of course, Walter Mead is the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I want to say thank you to both Foreign Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations for each giving some support to today's program. Walter's going to share his views and thoughts on this very important article he has authored on Israel-Palestinian issues. And then I've asked our Middle East Task Force Director, Daniel Levy, who himself blogs at prospectsforpeace.com, to join and offer comments after Walter's talk, and then I'm going to moderate a discussion with all of you. And so we have a full house, a lot of watchers online. Without further ado, please help welcome Walter Russell Mead.
Thanks, Steve, for that great introduction. And also, Steve, thanks for all that you've done over the years to make New America what it is, which is, I think, one of the most important forces in Washington for policy analysis and a genuine bipartisan spirit that really makes a difference. Those of us who've been involved with New America from the beginning are thrilled by the way that this organization has grown and developed and had an impact that I think when Cheryl Schweninger, Ted Halstead, and I were sitting around on couches in Manhattan years and years ago, we had no hope that something like this could emerge. So it's great to be here, great to be with the foundation, and great to be part of a series of programs that's put on by the New America Task Force on American Foreign Policy, which has done some very interesting work. What I want to do today is talk about some myths, I think, that shape the way we look at the at U.S. foreign policy, particularly with regard to this Middle East dispute between the Arabs and the Israelis, between the Palestinians and the Israelis, because there are, I think, some myths that make it hard for us to grapple with this thing clearly. The first myth is that there's an easy solution to this problem. You know, each administration comes in often with the idea that, you know, everybody else has been too blind. There's just a simple answer right out there, and all you have to do is really want it and go for it, and you'll get peace in the Middle East. But it's important to remember that this dispute has been festering for a very long time, and a lot of people have tried to solve it. You know, Lloyd George got Britain through World War I, but he didn't make much progress in the Middle East. Winston Churchill got Britain through World War II. He also signally failed to resolve the issues behind the British Mandate. Franklin D. Roosevelt was convinced that he knew what an answer was to this problem. He failed to square the circle of Jewish and Arab aspirations in what was then the British Mandate. The wise men who founded NATO and who built the bipartisan consensus on containment that got the U.S. through the Cold War, passed this problem down unsolved to later generations. Some, like Henry Kissinger and Jimmy Carter, have made, and the first George Bush, made partial progress toward a solution, but none of them have solved it completely. And more recently, we've seen two administrations, the Clinton administration and the second Bush administration, go into the Middle East with high hopes and yet come to the end of their time, as I think the Bush administration has now acknowledged, without a solution to this problem. So to think that somehow all of these statesmen of varying quality, but many among the greatest who ever lived, who've tried a wide variety of approaches to the issues, that somehow there's some magic trick that they've all overlooked, I think it's to make a big mistake. And the new administration needs to go into this Middle East process understanding that they are dealing with one of the most difficult, complex, and bitter disputes in our world today. Yet for all that, it seems to me that the new administration does need to make progress on the dispute between the Arabs, the Palestinians, and the Israelis, one of its most important priorities. The second myth that I think is worth referring to is a myth that in American foreign policy, a tail is wagging the dog here. That is to say that U.S. support for Israel reflects the kind of view of a small minority of Americans who have organized into what some have called an Israel lobby, and that it's the sort of undue pressure and influence of this group that causes American foreign policy to support Israel. Therefore, what has to be done is somehow the monopoly of this Israel lobby needs to be broken, and only then can the U.S. have sensible policy toward the Middle East. I think that very much misses the nature and the structure and the depth of American support for Israel. You can go back and look at polling going back as far as 1948, which I think is the year when the Gallup organization first began to poll on this question. And you'll find pretty consistently that the Americans who want to see a pro-Israel position in U.S. foreign policy has outnumbered those who want a pro-Arab or a pro-Palestinian position by roughly 3-to-1. Furthermore, support for Israel has actually grown in recent decades, and since 2001, it's basically been as high or higher than it had ever been. So that U.S. in this case, it seems to me that the dog is wagging the tail, that the United States has had a broadly supportive policy toward Israel in the Middle East, because that's what the majority or a very large plurality of Americans want. And while the Israel lobby has an influence, and it exists, its influence in a sense, its power comes from the fact that it's able to mobilize and rely on broad public support for Israel. So so politicians are worried about the Israel lobby because they don't want people saying you're anti-Israel. Because if the voters back home hear that their congressman or their senator is anti-Israel, the voters who are not Jewish in most cases, and very often not even evangelical Christians, will be concerned, because there is a very long and deep tradition in the United States of non-Jewish support for the State of Israel. That's really another subject. I've written about it in another issue of Foreign Affairs, but it's very important, I think, that we understand that the United States comes at these issues based on pretty deep-rooted convictions that are rather broadly dispersed among our body politic. The last poll I examined, if you look at the numbers, 97% of the Americans who want a pro-Israel foreign policy are not Jewish. And so I think if we want to understand why the United States has been supportive of Israel in some of the ways it's been, it's very important to look at that 97% and understand where that comes from and why it is. But this, I think, brings me to myth number 3, which is that a pro-Israel stance by the United States makes it impossible for the U.S. to play a positive role in Middle East peace negotiations. Again, I think that this is somewhat linked to myth number 1, that there's some easy solution out there. There's just some simple thing we could say or do that would make peace come. And so people say, well, why don't we do that? Well, that's because the Israel lobby is preventing the U.S. from taking this natural, simple, easy step that would bring peace. It is, unfortunately, a good deal more complicated than that. However, on the bright side, it seems to me that if you look very carefully at the situation in the Middle East, at the record of the negotiations, at the views and the interests of the key parties in this process, there are some very important things that an American president can do that help make peace more likely, improve the atmosphere for the very, very difficult negotiations between the two parties that ultimately will have to give us the final outline of a peace settlement, and which are politically sustainable at home in the United States and also overseas. That is to say, a country like the United States, which has a pro-Israel political tradition and pro-Israel sentiments, can in fact play a seriously positive role in creating an atmosphere that makes progress toward Middle East peace more likely. And I think for the Obama administration, this is a real opportunity, a chance to go forward and do some things that we haven't done before. What's the key? It seems to me conceptually, the key is to understand there are two key things that we need to do. Number one, understand conceptually that there are a lot of non-zero-sum issues on the table in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. That is, there are some things that are zero-sum. If a piece of land is going to be part of Palestine, it cannot be part of Israel. That is zero-sum. Where that boundary line is drawn in Jerusalem, where it's drawn throughout the country, that's zero-sum, and what one gets, the other doesn't get. At the same time, there are other issues like the right of return. How many Palestinian refugees go to end up within the boundaries of 1967 Israel? Again, every one that doesn't go home is, it's non-zero, it's a zero-sum thing. What one gains, the other loses. The two parties, with advice, help, support, and other things from their friends, will have to reach some kind of mutually acceptable arrangement on these on these zero-sum issues. But there are many other, and they are vital issues that are not zero-sum. For example, what is the future of Palestinians who don't return going to be? What happens to the Palestinians who, right now there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians 60 years after the Israeli War of Independence who do not have passports, who may live in a place like Lebanon where they do not have basic economic and social and civil rights. What is their future going to be? To provide an honest, decent, dignified, and just road into the future for these people is not necessarily to take something away from Israel. In fact, it seems to me, if one views this clearly, to improve the choices and the conditions of Palestinians is to add both to Palestinians and to Israelis. Ultimately, and Israelis I think know this, peace will only be real if Palestinians consent to it. That is to say, let me give you an example of a difficult, age-old dispute that was finally settled. And that's the dispute, the Irish quest for independence against Britain. And in the 1920s, Ireland was divided, and some of it went to the Republic, what is now the Republic of Ireland, and some of it remained part of the United Kingdom. Well, that was not, unfortunately, the end to the violence and the terrorism in Ireland, in Britain. And even today, 80 years later, it's still possible that there will be bombs or incidents regarding this. However, over time, Irish opinion, the majority of Irish opinion supported peace and opposed terrorism. And the minority of Irish nationalists who wanted to continue a violent struggle even after partition was gradually brought under control, and the determination of the Irish people in the independent Republic of Ireland to make peace last is what has ultimately provided the security for the British, the Northern Irish, and the Irish in Southern Ireland. Now, we all can understand that when there is a peace treaty between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not everybody is going to like it on either side. And there will be a minority who will want to continue armed struggle and will consider that as legitimate. For Israelis, one of the biggest questions going forward, a question that haunts Israeli negotiators, is will the new Palestinian state be willing and able to provide the kind of security that Israel will need to make sure that the minority who continue to oppose and resist the peaceful compromise can ultimately be controlled? Or, if public opinion is too supportive of that resistance, will the government be weak and ineffective and maybe politically unable to take the difficult steps that might be required? Making peace more just and, in Palestinian eyes, more legitimate and more desirable and more popular is, in fact, the best way to have a peace treaty that will stick and will provide Israel with the security that Israel desperately seeks. So that to ensure that as part of the peace arrangement, all of the issues that are important to Palestinians and to Palestinian opinion are addressed as fully, as justly, as generously, as thoughtfully as possible, is a vital part not only of getting a peace that works for the Palestinians, but of getting a peace that works for Israel. And I think there's the second key that we need to think about here is that many of us who are neither Israeli nor Palestinian like to sort of sit back and feel morally superior to those squabbling Israelis and Palestinians. Why can't they be more reasonable? Why are they so inflamed? Why are they, why can't they be more reasonable like us? We have, I think, forgotten that, or never perhaps in some cases realized, that the situation there is not just a problem between Israelis and Palestinians. It's not, Israelis would like to say it's the Arab resistance, their refusal to accept reality and so on that is the cause of the problem. Palestinians will say it's the Israeli attacks on us, our dispossession. That's the problem, and both sides have some legitimate points to make here. But let's go back to 1947, 1948 Palestine and think about what happened, honestly and clearly. What happened was the British Mandate, which was the international community's Britain was the authorized deputy of the international community to provide order and security to this under the terms of a League of Nations mandate. As the British began to retreat from that mandate, facing trouble on the ground, economic problems in Britain. This was the time where the British Empire was falling and the British were withdrawing not only from Palestine but also from India. The world community sat back and failed to provide security either to the Jewish community of Palestine or to the Arab community of Palestine. That is to say, there was no state, there was no framework of authority, neither community had security. And in that atmosphere of essentially anarchy and of a dereliction of duty by the international community as a whole, each people did what it could under the circumstances to defend itself. Furthermore, the Arab states in the neighborhood also intervened in this vacuum. But as we look at that, and we think about how do we deal with it now, too often there's a tendency to blame one side or the other in the conflict for the dispossession of the Palestinians, for the refugee problem that was created, and so on and so on. In fact, it seems to me, yes, one has to say the Israelis have some responsibility, the Arabs have some responsibility, but the international community, I think, bears an ultimate responsibility here. And when we think about how do we provide compensation for Palestinians, how do we recognize the injustice that they have suffered, how do we help Palestinians find new, better lives, new and better futures within the context of a two-state solution, which is a very painful compromise for both sides. The international community has to step up to financial, moral, legal, and political responsibility for its own failures to protect. Israel cannot bear this alone, the Palestinians cannot bear it alone, but in order for peace to come, the international community, I believe, led by the United States, and I hope very much led by our President-elect, needs to step up to the plate and provide some leadership so that the ongoing tragedy of Palestinian dispossession, the wrongs that Palestinians have suffered, can be addressed in a conscientious, thoughtful, moral, and practical way. And so that a peace treaty between what will be the state of Palestine and the state of Israel will also provide a real settlement, a real solution for the problems of millions of dispossessed Palestinians on the West Bank, in Gaza, throughout the Middle East and the world. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much. I wanted to also point out, as I call Daniel Levy up to the the podium that Amjad Attallah, who's here with us, put your hand up, Amjad, is our new co-director with Daniel Levy of our newly launched Middle East Task Force. So very good to have Amjad with us. I think this is the first public announcement of that, much to the chagrin of those people who've been running the Save Darfur coalition from whence we've stolen Amjad. So, Daniel.
Thank you, Steve, and really thank you, Walter, for the comments here and for the piece that we're talking about. And I'd also just like to acknowledge and recognize and say how much I'm looking forward to...
Bring the mic down.
Yeah, why not? How much I'm looking forward to working with Amjad Attallah. We first met, actually, across the negotiating table when Amjad was in the Palestinian negotiating team. I was in the Israeli negotiating team, and we'll now be co-directing this Middle East Task Force and looking forward to hosting many events together. Walter, I very much enjoy the way you introduce the subject in your piece, where you say that the Obama administration, in dealing with the Middle East peace process, is a necessary evil. And I like to think of myself as being in the business of necessary evil. So I appreciate you framing it thus. And I'd really like to take your point of departure, which is to see the Israel-US relationship as a given, as something that has good reasons behind it, and as something that can be mutually positive for both the partners in that relationship. And for me, that's where the necessary evil of resolving the conflict comes in. Because I think we're at a place today, and you talk about this, where the cost to the US of being allied by a party in an unresolved conflict that has such resonance in the region, aligned with the cost to Israel of this ongoing conflict, taken together with the really strong sense in the region that the window may be closing, not as an alarmist thing, but as a reflection of the reality that the window may be closing on the two-state solution, could leave that Israeli-American relationship in a place where we have fewer and fewer, and ultimately no good options, in terms of what both of those sides of that relationship can then pursue. I think for Israel in particular, a US administration that cannot get its head around how I can do conflict resolution on Israel-Palestine while staying true to my relationship with Israel, but being able to increase the pie by looking at the non-zero sum, as you have called them, the non-zero sum components with this, of this. If you have a US administration that can't get its head around that, then it ends up creating a disincentive structure on the Israeli side for actually resolving the conflict and doing what is in Israel's interest. If you don't have an engagement that can help bring Israel to the space that the majority of Israelis and their decision makers increasingly understand that they have to go to, for all the hyperbole and rhetoric and toughness that you'll see in the Israeli election campaign right now, the interesting thing is that Benjamin Netanyahu is trying, as he did when he won an election in 1996, is trying to say, hey, I'm not a seed no inch crazy right winger. You'll have a peace process with me. When Ehud Olmert, the outgoing prime minister, turned around and said, without a two-state solution, Israel's finished. And what do we do with our supporters in the US if we face an ugly campaign from Israel's perspective of making this about one-state democracy and anti-apartheid? From an Israeli perspective, if you don't have American engagement to help us walk the final distance to resolve this, which is of course very difficult on the Israeli side in terms of what's going to be needed, in terms of the degree of trust in a future that we can't totally predict. If you don't have that, then it skews the Israeli decision-making options in absolutely the wrong direction. And so you come up with this. You didn't quote it, and I love this in the piece, so I'll quote it. You come up with this idea that Washington can change the way that a peace deal is framed and thus make it more appealing to both sides. The Obama administration needs to accomplish a kind of Copernican shift in perception, looking at the same sun, moon, planets, and stars that others have seen. It must reconceptualize the relations amongst them. In the past, US peacemakers have had an Israel-centric approach to the negotiating process. The Obama administration needs to put Palestinian politics and Palestinian public opinion at the center of its peacemaking efforts. And I just want to reflect on that for a moment. We're very tin-eared. Israeli democracy is something that's immediately recognizable. There are the kind of political parties that we can identify with, the characters can... Everyone in Israel right now is trying to claim the Obama mantle. So the Netanyahu website looks just like the Obama website, and the new left formation that will be voted on today is saying, well, of course, we're the Obama. Like, it looks very familiar. Palestinian politics doesn't look really like something that you would consider familiar. The characters aren't immediately translatable as characters that you're familiar with. But politics in the Palestinian side, in the Arab and Muslim world, absolutely exists. And as you said, unless there is a legitimacy, a sufficient legitimacy inside the Palestinian community, society, then that's bad for Israel. And that's what I would say that's the key flaw in where we are now with Annapolis. That by not looking at the same sun, stars, moon, etc., and trying to come up with a different solution, by going back to what we tried in Oslo, we're actually creating a process that suffers from a law of diminishing returns. It has ever less credibility by looking at the same zero-sum components and saying, can't we rearrange them? It suffers each time from even less credibility amongst both Israelis and Palestinians. So I think it's a good idea to use this distinction between zero-sum and non-zero-sum. And many of us have been working for many years on where do you exactly draw the borderline? What's your arrangement in Jerusalem? Nomi Chazan, who's the former deputy speaker of the Israeli Knesset and a former Israeli Knesset member and now chair of the New Israel Fund, was standing where I am less than a month ago, giving a talk here at New America. And she argued to look at two things in particular. And that was, one, internationalize it more. The Israelis and Palestinians can't do this on their own. And number two, we need to break our heads to think how we can change the ingredients, how we can look differently. Yes, we have the Clinton parameters, we have the Geneva Initiative I was very involved in, but there's things we'll need to do differently if it's going to work. And I want to close by saying that if one can look at those non-zero-sum components and take very seriously this idea that on the Palestinian side there needs to be something that is more inclusive, has more capacity to be legitimate, be more acceptable, and therefore be more likely to stick, which is what the Israelis need. It's no use for Israel to do something that doesn't stick, that's not respected on the other side, that's not sustainable on the other side. And one of the things that I take from what you just said and from the piece, which I think broadens it and allows us to internationalize it, to think afresh and to focus on the non-zero-sum aspects, is the narrative around the Palestinian refugees. And I think those of us who've been working on it have known from the start that one of the hardest things would be how could you get a sufficient sense of Palestinian acceptance of a solution on the refugee question that Israel would be able to live with. And all of us have recognized that part of that is going to be the narrative. How do you confer dignity? Dignity is so important. And I think there is an international role. And you've suggested that the Obama administration acknowledge the suffering, acknowledge what went on, and play an active part in resolving this, both by the discourse around the Palestinian refugee reality and by the compensation mechanisms. I don't know if the president-elect is going to give a speech in a Muslim capital. I would love this to be one of the ideas that they try and get their heads around in terms of what that speech would contain. I'll close by saying that I think there are other elements, and you begin to touch on them, and I think others can develop them, of what is this expanding the non-zero sum component. One of them is security. I don't think Palestinians want to live in a society that is militarized and where it's security strongmen who play a serious role in politics. I remember the very first negotiations with the Palestinians over Palestinian elections and the number of members of parliament and building the Palestinian security forces. It was often our Palestinian interlocutors who said, don't stick us with a system where we're going to end up run by military strongmen. And on the Israeli side, I don't see that we will be able to develop the sufficient degree of trust needed to hand territory over to Palestinian security forces. So here again, I think there's a role for internationals to get involved in the security arena. Again, broadening it out, giving an international role, one can use the Arab Peace Initiative. So when Israelis make peace with Palestinians, you're also getting the buy-in from the Arab world. And when Palestinians make peace with Israelis, they're getting the support of the Arab world and other such aspects. So I was excited to read the piece. Myself and Steve spoke. We're very happy that you could be here today and talk about the piece. And I do think this narrative that is, first of all, recognizing of the fact that we can do the mutually supportive Israeli-American relationship better. And secondly, that we can take a lead role as the international community and as the United States in addressing some of the key components of the historical narrative that can redeem a sense of Palestinian dignity in the broadest possible Palestinian community, and that can therefore get us to the next phase and allow Palestinians to develop their independent state with a sense that not the historical file has been closed, but that it has been addressed in a way that is serious. And thirdly, that we can internationalize components of this and thereby address the necessary evil. I think it's a good place to start in this holiday season, so thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. As I open the floor to questions, I want to just pose one to Walter on the front end of this. You know, I get the sense that you, in the history, the narrative that you've provided of the sort of efforts to try and deal with this problem, particularly from the various U.S. administrations over a very long period of time, and the failure to do so over an equally long period of time, that we were nonetheless, to some degree, able to sustain that. And I guess my question is, as you look forward, I mean, you wrote this piece for a reason. Do you sense that the consequences to the United States of failing to achieve results are growing? Or can we have another couple of generations of failure to resolve this?
Well, I guess I would say that, first of all, the distinction between success and failure is not entirely clear-cut. That is to say, it's not as if it's all light on one side and all darkness on the other. But I think that we all can remember how in the 1990s, particularly when the Oslo Process was in its more optimistic phases, that was a better time in Israel, for Palestinians, throughout the Middle East, and for American relations, generally internationally. While in the last 8 years, we've seen a much darker scenario. So I think we need to, I think the importance of having not just a sham peace process, which is there sort of for window dressing's sake, but have a serious process of engagement in which Israelis and Palestinians are coming closer and working out the ways in which they're going to live together. That's key. And when that's not in place, then I think the U.S. interests, the interests of people in the region, and literally the peace and security of the entire world are weakened and undermined. So I think we've got to get into this. It's an urgent issue. We shouldn't think we're going to solve it on a 6-month timetable, but we need to get to work.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Clyde Prestowitz, my former boss, president of the Economic Strategy Institute, from whom Walter hired me away from. Old history.
Hey, Walter, how are you?
Good to see you, Clay.
Walter, I just wanted to ask you two things. One, I wanted to challenge you a little bit on your myths. When you began by saying there's a myth that there's an easy solution to this. I'd really like to know who thinks there's an easy solution to it. But look, beyond that, I have had the feeling in the last several years that a kind of a consensus has been forming around the idea that the Oslo process failed because it didn't grapple quickly enough with what you call the zero-sum issues. And that if there's going to be any hope for a two-state solution, that actually the opposite approach should be taken, namely that it's important to get all the issues on the table and negotiate them like fast and get a deal done. It sounds to me like what you're proposing is a renewal of the Oslo process. And since that failed once, I guess the question is, why do you think it would succeed a second time?
Okay, well, first, it may be that not many people think there's an easy solution to this, but unfortunately their ranks tend to often include incoming presidents of the United States. But actually, if you read a lot of the press commentary and look at the public opinion, there is, I think, an unwillingness by a lot of people around the world to realize, to fully accept that the reason peace is so elusive is not due to a handful of weak or bad people somewhere, but is due to the very, very difficult nature of the interests involved in this conflict. Look, on the question of the Oslo thing, I don't think we should simply get back to the Oslo process. That's not really what I'm proposing. I suppose I would look for, I think we have to recognize, and this is where I think Oslo did go wrong, was that the non-zero-sum issues and the zero-sum issues are interlinked. I think the American negotiators, particularly in the case of the Oslo process, tended to think that their political problem was mostly to come up with a deal that they could get Yasser Arafat to sign. And they sort of simplified Palestinian politics to this question of, Yasser Arafat, they felt, could deliver, in quotes, the Palestinians to a peace deal. And so they just had to deliver Arafat, and then Arafat could deliver peace. I don't think they paid enough attention to the real political constraints on Arafat's ability. For example, Arafat's political standing among Palestinians was continually in decline during the 1990s for a number of reasons. But some of them were related to the unpopularity of some of the concessions, it seemed, that he was considering. And in the end, I think Arafat felt that politically he could not sign, and he could not deliver Palestinian opinion on that deal. So it seems to me that as the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Americans, and others involved in this move back onto negotiations, in part building on maybe some progress in Annapolis, but in part looking at other ideas, they're going to have to they're going to have to work on these two things together. And they're going to have to be thinking about, how do we make this a politically sustainable and popular approach among Palestinians? I just think that without that approach, it's very unlikely that an Oslo-style process, or indeed any other style process, could get a solution that can stick.
I'm blinded back there. I think it's Lorelei in the back, right? Lorelei Kelly?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen, both, especially for giving us something to do, those of us who are staying here this week. My question to you, I think I really love the language you're using. I come from a world of conflict resolution. I think this is something that's been needed for a long time, is to use a language that a lot of Americans understand in dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I worked in Congress for years, And this was a really hard thing to work on. I mean, sometimes it was even hard to get a room to bring in people to talk about sort of the more non-traditional approaches to a peace process or whatever. And the thing that gives me hope, last weekend I spent with sort of the Obama 2.0 folks, which was the big electronic organizing, the 13 million list of people who are out there and waiting for sort of the next meaningful way to be engaged in government. And I know that national security, and especially this issue, aren't subject to pluralism like a lot of other decision making. But I'm wondering, have you given any thought to how what you're talking about could somehow plug in to this new activated base that's very interested in these kinds of issues, and that somehow it could move this issue further in Congress than has been allowed over the last decade? Does that make sense to you?
Well, I have to say I haven't been thinking in those terms myself. I'm a senior fellow at a think tank, and one think tank, and member of the board of another, and that's enough for me to do. I don't know if you have some more thoughts on that topic.
I do think this is an issue where because there has not been an attempt to stake out a ground, enough of an attempt to stake out a ground which says, hey, actually, if you can get to a conflict resolution place on this, if you can get a serious model that can work, that's the best for the Israelis and that's the best for the Palestinians. Because not enough has been done to do that, I think it's one of these issues that you're either pro-Israeli or you're pro-Palestinian or you're anti-Israeli. And I think there's a very big community out there, and I imagine most of the 13 million are in that space, but I imagine it extends well beyond that and deep into the Jewish community. Because I think there was a very particular scare campaign with the Jewish community in this last election over who Barack Hussein Obama might be. And it didn't work, which I think says something not only about how irredeemably in the Dem camp the Jewish community is, but I also think suggests something about where the politics also, but not only, on Israel issues are. So I think there is a language, and all I'd say is that I think I would give encouragement to the people who are doing that 2.0 to be, it might have to happen the other way around. The Obama administration might have to be convinced that the constituency is out there that will support this, and therefore will echo that with their members of Congress, and therefore Congress will feel comfortable with that. I'm confident that that does exist.
I just want to add to this before I go to the many hands in the room. The reason I'm very interested in this issue is if you read the Israeli press, the views as articulated by Walter are very ever present in the Israeli press. This sort of thinking about how to get the other side right. And I think the question you raised, Lorelei, is important, is what sort of fads, what sort of outreach can you do, what sort of framing? I'm a sort of evolved realist. I'm out there, I tell people that, in the sense that I have progressive goals, but I sort of want to know the shrewd Nixonian way to deliver on results. And what Walter has given is a shrewd Nixonian, he may not see it this way, but it is a Nixonian pathway to sort of achieving results that stick. I've been watching for some time friends of ours at the Center for American Progress and other places help hatch this idea of responsibility to protect, often thinking about African development and sort of the 21st century global justice issues. And there's a lot of validity in moving in that direction. My friendly critique has been, show me the game plan on what your priorities are and how you're going to achieve tough results. And so cynicism and sort of a tougher review often help you get there. And also thinking about how you achieve results on the other side. So I've never heard R2P applied in whatsoever to the Palestinian case, which Walter has just done, perhaps by not articulating it, but it's one of the ways in which you can sort of look at some of the new fads, if you will, in foreign policy. And what Walter has given us is a lot of interesting framing and thinking that allows some other folks to find a place on how to think about a results-oriented strategy. Walter, I hope I haven't offended you too much in that in that mix there. It was beneath the Nixonian comments a deep compliment.
Well, that's, it's not often that people first compare you to Nixon and then tell you it's a compliment. I'll take what I can get.
You are the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow. Yes, right here in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, Andrea Baron from George Mason University. Yes, Walter, in your article, you talked about a comprehensive peace strategy from the Obama administration, and I applaud your idea to internationalize the issue of Palestinian refugees. But don't you have to deal with the West Bank in order for there to be a comprehensive peace strategy? And don't you think a good beginning would be to talk about the need for Israel to stop settlement expansion so that Palestinian economic development can take place?
Thank you.
Well, I think, I deliberately didn't write an article that would touch on every aspect of a 100-year-old dispute. It's long been my sense is that settlements are not helpful, and don't, in my personal view, new settlements do not enhance Israel's security and make a difficult situation worse. However, that wasn't what I was writing about, and so that's why I didn't put it in the article.
Right here. Yes, sir.
Thanks. I'm Bill Harrop, former American ambassador to Israel. I wanted to just say a word or two about one of your myths, which troubled me a bit. You discounted the influence or the importance of the Israel lobby by explaining that the vast majority of Americans are pro-Israel, favor Israel, and are concerned at the notion that a politician is anti-Israel, which makes politicians very loath to appear anti-Israel. Isn't the very power of the Israel lobby in its ability to make any criticism of Israel, any criticism of the settlement movement, or any discussions that are of policy which are not sympathetic to the nationalistic right wing in Israel, appear to be anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic? It seems to me that's what the Israel lobby does, and that's why it is such an influence in our politics.
I guess, again, I think that, you can look at a power, you look at a sailboat that's moving a beautiful sort of America's Cup racing yacht that's moving very rapidly over the water and maneuvering brilliantly and doing well. And it's obviously got a terrific captain, and it's obviously got a terrific crew, and people have put a lot of money into it, it's clear. But why is that boat moving as fast as it is? It seems to me ultimately you do have to look at the wind and not at the boat for the understanding that if the wind were to stop blowing, even the most brilliantly crewed and expensively designed and well-funded America's Cup yacht would come to a stop. If we look at the history of the tobacco lobby, it seems to me there's something similar here. There was a time in this country where people talked about the tobacco lobby and big tobacco as the power in Washington, that you simply could not cross that lobby. And any politician who got on the wrong side of big tobacco was going to have a very short and unhappy career. And it was a well-funded lobby, and it did get a lot of what it wanted. But then something happened. Public opinion on the question of smoking began to change. Very, very quickly, big tobacco, even though the lobby had the same staff that it had before, and the same budget, even higher budgets, as tobacco companies were desperately trying to keep their power, even though they were giving as much money as ever to politicians, they began to lose fights. Ultimately, you got to a point where if a politician took money from the tobacco lobby, that is what cost them votes. People would say, you are the pawn of big tobacco. You're killing American children for the sake of campaign contributions. So, yes, there is an Israeli lobby, or an Israel lobby, I should say. And yes, it's a very well-designed ship, and it moves rapidly. But if you want to understand why American politics goes the way it is, ultimately it is more about the wind than it is about the ship. Do I think the Israel lobby, such as it is, and again, we have, one of the problems with some of the books on this subject is they don't define what the Israel lobby is, and they'll say sort of that, boy, when Bill Clinton was pushing the Israelis to make more concessions on Jerusalem in 2000, that was a triumph of the Israel lobby. In fact, a book on the Israel lobby made that point. And then when George Bush is telling Sharon, I support you no matter what you do, that's another triumph for the Israel lobby. But you've got to be a little bit, which Israel lobby? There are many different ones, many different stands. So in general, it seems to me that that the important thing to keep in mind is that American public opinion, non-Jewish public opinion, is going to remain pretty staunchly pro-Israel, pretty much as far as the eye can see, as far as my eye can see. Nevertheless, there are some very interesting and important things that can, and in my view, should be done to create a more, I think, more hopeful atmosphere that will help Israel as much as it helps anybody else. Who knows? Maybe you're going to look at my career and say, boy, he's published that article in Foreign Affairs, and then, he's never able to publish anything again. They couldn't get lunch in this town. I don't think that's going to happen.
Dan, you wanted to offer a quick comment?
Yeah,
just really fast.
I wouldn't want to go too far with the tobacco lobby analogy, but this would be part of the conversation that I have with the mainstream Israel lobby. Is be careful. This is what Olmert said. He said, if we can't get a two-state solution, and I'm almost quoting exactly here, we begin to look like South Africa. And once that happens, even our Jewish supporters in the United States will not be with us. Now, I don't think it's a short distance from here to what happened to the tobacco lobby, but I do think we're in for some pretty ugly times, and it's why I also urge a certain caution in dealing with the Iran issue. I think we're in for some pretty ugly times. If Israel is locked in to a two-state solution can't be done anymore, and the Palestinians are beginning to run a competent campaign on give us our democratic rights. That's why I think Israel's supporters in this country, irrespective almost of what Israel needs, almost for their own needs, should be articulating something closer to a J Street line, which is what I'm supportive of. So I think there's maybe more to that tobacco lobby analogy without taking it too far than
Warren Coates and then Gary Mitchell, and we'll try and hit as many as we can.
Thank you, Warren Coates. Well, one of the keys surely is the ability for Palestine to develop an effective and respected government. And I think the failure of the Oslo peace process was partly a failure for that to happen. What are your thoughts? Obviously, Israel's policies influence that. American policies influence that. It's mainly a Palestinian thing that only they can resolve. But what international efforts, U.S. efforts, et cetera, can help facilitate and promote the development of an effective Palestinian government?
There are a lot of things that can be done, which is another way of saying you've identified a very important and complicated problem. But let me just sort of stick to things that are kind of relevant to the points I've been trying to make today and that are in the article, which is that part of what we have to understand is that making peace for Palestinians is a political process. And Palestinian institutions and political culture faces some real difficulties in doing that. For one thing, let's think about representation. That is to say, this peace treaty between the Israelis and the Palestinians has huge consequences for Palestinians living in Lebanon, Palestinians in Syria, in Jordan, throughout the world. But if we think about elections for the Palestinian Authority, which will empower and credential the negotiators, they don't have seats. So how does, where is the representation? And this is an important issue because, in fact, if the diaspora doesn't support the peace and then becomes an organization that funds terrorists, like, for example, many Irish in the United States. You had some supporting the IRA. It makes it harder for peace to stick. So there are real problems of representation. But you also have within Palestine and among Palestinians, and this is something that I think people in the U.S. haven't paid enough attention to, is you have many different points of view and interests within the Palestinian national community. For example, most people very few people lived in what's now the Gaza Strip before 1948. Most of the people who live there are refugees who arrived essentially penniless and built huts in the desert. And to some degree, that's what Gaza still is, a place without a viable economy, where very few people have a real stake in things as they are now, and where it's difficult to think, what is their future? You cannot, and yet these people, there are enough of them and their interests are clear enough, they're going to be a big factor in Palestinian politics and institutions. If we look at the West Bank, we can see there's some Palestinians who are basically still living, on the same farms or in the same towns they've been living in for thousands of years. And then there are others who are living in refugee camps or otherwise scattered through the territory. And peace means different things to all of these people. Because again, if you're a farmer and you have a nice olive farm, peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians would be a very good thing for you. You stop worrying that a settlement is going to pop up in your orchard someday. You stop worrying that on the day you have to get your workers to your crop, the Israelis will have some kind of security freeze so you can't get through. There are your life gets easier and better. But if you are living in a refugee camp, it's not so clear that changing the flag over that camp is going to solve a lot of your problems. And so if you look at Palestinian opinion historically, you can see that often the people who are most in favor of a two-state solution and a compromise are those who have a real stake in it. Now, if we think that what we're doing, if we just sort of project a political two-state solution that doesn't have real answers to the concrete everyday problems of Palestinian refugees in Gaza or Palestinian poor and dispossessed in the West Bank or what have you, then basically you're going to have a peace that is not widely seen as just, legitimate, or helpful. And the relationship of the government that has to enforce that peace to its citizens is necessarily going to be a somewhat difficult relationship. You are creating a situation in which it will be very hard, if not impossible, for Palestinians to honor their obligations under the Treaty of Peace and also develop representative, effective institutions for governance. So the kinds of steps I'm talking about constructing a peace deal that is offers real solutions for the problems and the situations and the dilemmas of ordinary Palestinians, it seems to me is actually a necessary step as part of the process of creating the environment in which a strong, free Palestinian state can grow, and where there can be representative institutions that are responsible and effective and legitimate. But it will not be easy under any circumstances. I think it may not be possible unless we can address some of the issues that I've been talking about.
Thank you. Gary Mitchell?
Thanks. Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. And Walter, this really follows on the most recent question. So let me do it quickly and say that perhaps it's Ptolemaic of me to ask the question in this way, but I listen to what you have to say. It makes a great deal of sense to me, and I think to myself, so what would Copernicus do about two things, it seems to me, that are making this, dealing with your first myth, there are no easy solutions. The first, of course, is the fact that you say we need to put the Palestinian interest at the center of our thinking, but the question is, this is a bifurcated state literally and politically. So A, how do we do that? And B, given that you say this is not an easy solution and it isn't going to come quickly, we also have an Israel that continues to develop new settlements at a rapid pace. So I'm interested in how you think Copernicus might sort of get us out of this mess.
Thank you.
Well, Copernicus would probably say I'm an astronomer, not a peacemaker. But look, I think, again, one of the problems that the peace process faces in Israel is that because it appears that there is no Palestinian partner willing and able to deliver security on the basis of a two-state solution, there's not a lot of appetite in Israel to make the sacrifices that Israel would have to make in order to make a two-state solution viable. One of the interesting things about the Middle East process, and something I talk about in the article, but I'm certainly not the first person to look at, is that the process is sort of unbalanced. At the beginning of any peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, basically the Palestinians have to give up a lot. They have to say, okay, we're going to talk to you, we recognize you as, and now we're going to be talking really about a two-state compromise. So a lot of Israel's key demands are have to be met by the Palestinians almost as the price of admission to conversation. And that's one of the reasons that Arafat, after having signed all of this, found himself in a terrible trap, because he was under pressure. Now that you've made all these concessions, where are the concessions from Israel that balance it? So he becomes a man in a terrible hurry once he's done this. But on the Israeli side, the dynamic is just the opposite, because you get a lot of what you want at the beginning of the process. Here are the Palestinians, they're talking to you, they're sort of de facto acknowledging you're a state, they're moving toward compromise. But at the end, that's where the Israelis, they have to pull out of the West Bank. They're going to have to dismantle some settlements. It's going to be a wrenching, horrible process. And suppose they do all this, and then the day after peace is declared, a rocket comes over from Gaza. And they call up the Palestinian prime minister and say, do something about the rocket from Gaza. He says, I'm sorry, I'm fishing this week, or whatever. What do they do then? So the Israelis have to, at the end, the process is unbalanced in a sense in favor of the Palestinians, where the Israelis are the ones making very serious concessions and just have to kind of hope and pray and trust that there's going to be a reciprocation on the other side. And so what you find is, as a peace process moves forward, there's a tendency for the Israelis to drag their, at the beginning, it's the Palestinians that are dragging their heels and have to be kind of pushed into it. And then at the end, it's the Israelis that are dragging their heels. And because the Israeli political system is a pretty fragmented one where it's hard to get stable coalitions and strong views, every prime minister negotiating is having to look over his shoulder all the time. And Israeli public opinion is nervous about making these sacrifices. So I think by trying to kind of look at how do we, by making the peace process the peace deal look more attractive and welcoming to Palestinians, then give it greater credibility among Israelis, that this Copernican step of putting the Palestinian concerns at the center of how do we craft, develop, and move toward this and envision this two-state solution, then also makes it easier in Israel for Israeli politicians and Israeli leaders to make the serious case that if you want your children and grandchildren to have a safer life, then we need to look at these at the zero-sum elements, and start figuring out what we're going to trade for what.
Right here,
Can I
and
just
then
add
Andre.
something?
Yeah, real quick.
And there, a structure of gradualism only makes it more difficult. And I think that was a key weakness of Oslo. The idea that you could sustain the Palestinian institution building, Palestinian economy building, Palestinian security building, under a situation where there's a foreign occupation that's viewed, understandably, as very hostile, with dispersed settlements that are expanding and need to be protected, What it did in the end, I think, is it created a small coterie of Palestinians who were part of the system, but who are increasingly divorced from their own public. Therefore, they're very bought into just keeping the negotiations going. And an Israeli leadership that says, wow, I can have lots of the good things of having a peace process without having to do the tough things and turning to my public and actually having to get support on the zero-sum issues. So let's just keep having a process. So if you build a strong package of this is the end game, only then do you actually ask the Israelis to face clear choices. And in that respect, trying to do it in a bilateral negotiation where the final Israeli concessions are being made by an Israeli leader to the chair of the PLO is way less attractive than those concessions being given to the President of the United States, which is why I think that the greater American role needs to be there. And on the Palestinian side, it's why you need to, as we've been talking about, really address what makes this work for the Palestinians, because on its own, especially as it's evolved over the last 15 years now, that since we've been in the Oslo process, there's not much ownership today on the Palestinian side of the two-state solution, or even of Palestinian statehood.
This gentleman, and then Amjad, and we'll work back.
Thank you. Jim Zanotti, Congressional Research Service. Thank you for being here today. My question, I want to pick up a little bit on the dynamics that were brought up in the last couple of questions. Mr. Meade, you brought up the limitations of changing the flag over Gaza, the signature of Yasser Arafat on the dotted line, and then on the other side of the fragmentation of Israeli politics. And so I was curious to know what room there might be in your prescriptions for the notion of so-called popular negotiating committees. There was an article, I believe, just a few months ago in Middle East Policy, which picked up on the notion of popular negotiating committees in Northern Ireland and also in South Africa as having perhaps generated some sort of a momentum where you have the one condition that you have on participation is, and it's not track two, these are more formalized negotiating committees, the one condition you have on participation is that they're not participating in any violence. And so the notion is that on one side you get the ball rolling for those who are not rejectionists, and then on the other side you have the ability on a more grassroots level to have momentum going without there being the fits and starts of change within, you know, the more sort of traditional top-down deal-making ranks. And so I was just curious to know how you thought that might fit in, particularly when you're talking about an unrepresented diaspora, perhaps linking them back in this sort of fashion.
Well, I think, you know, I would certainly be the last person to be close to any kind of discussions and negotiations at any level. But I think in some ways what I'm talking about here is a discussion. There needs to be some discussion that's less between Israelis and Palestinians than with the international community, and starting to think about taking some responsibility and bringing some more resources onto the table. Because what we've had is a pattern where, you know, the Israelis and the Palestinians can't deal with each other very much about the non-zero sum issues because they don't, you know, their resources are limited. You know, what is going to happen to the Palestinians in Gaza? How will they emerge to have a dignified human life after 60 years as refugees in the desert? What about the Palestinians in Lebanon? Where are they going to live? What are they going to do? These are questions that can only, maybe the parties on the ground can only give constructive suggestions when the international community has sort of made, you know, stepped up to the plate and made some commitments here. So I think there are a lot, I think this problem was created by a lot of different agents over a long period of time. It's likely that the knot is going to be unpicked by a lot of different hands working in a lot of different ways. And so the more the merrier, as far as I can see.
Amjad Attallah, and then hand the mic over to Mike Olshausen after you're done with that.
Thanks, Walter. For an issue that's been dissected as much as this one, for anybody to be able to take a fresh perspective on it is really an admirable accomplishment. So thanks for actually bringing in a part of this conflict that's almost completely ignored by conventional wisdom. But what I wanted to ask you is to take it from the macro level to the micro level. There are specific policies that result from some of your recommendations, but I wanted to know, what do you think that President Obama would have to do in order to break with the policies of either the past 8 years or the past 16 years in order to accomplish some of the things that you're talking about? And keep in mind something that Daniel said, the complete devaluation of American policy statements over the last 16 years in the Middle East. President Clinton went to Gaza and spoke to Palestinians about their dispossession. And that actually was very moving. There were grown men in the audience who cried when they heard the President of the United States talking about it. But there was never a follow-up in terms of implementation of policy on it. And President Bush has spoken as eloquently as anybody about the need for democracy among Palestinians before he tried to overthrow the democratically elected Palestinian government. So in light of how cynical everyone has become, what are the actual policy statements, the actual policy differences do you think that President Obama needs to concentrate on in order to give effect to some of these ideas?
Well, I think one example of the change would be that if the president-elect, once he's in office, it's clear that he's making a serious effort to convene a group that will develop and fund a compensation process tied to the peace. I agree with you that very often where people have realized a need for America to reach out to Palestinians, they've responded at the level of rhetoric. So it seems to me that if Palestinians and others see that the U.S. is quite serious about making peace something that works for the average Palestinian and addresses the needs of Palestinians, and that progress is being made toward the creation and the funding of the institutions and the measures, and that the U.S. is convening groups, including our European allies and others, and that there's a whole new sort of approach here. I think we'll see maybe not people as cynical and as frequently, but no two peoples have been as betrayed by history as much in the 20th century as the Israelis and the Palestinians, in different ways and at different times and by different people. But both begin with an attitude of deep cynicism because they've heard a lot of it before. So I think what we will need to see is something that moves beyond statements of policy toward serious engagement. And even so, cynicism will not die overnight.
Thanks. Mike?
Yeah, I'm Mike Olshausen, Contemporary Review. At present, both peoples live in quasi-states. One of them lives in a contiguous state, and the other, as has been mentioned, lives in a state with two parts, one of which is crisscrossed by roadways and has settlements and essentially colonies in it. What's really wrong with that? Why not have a state which is contiguous, very coherent, that does reflect a nation which is very old, very coherent, has great time depth, and the other reflects something, or a people, yes, but not really a nation. It's certainly not one which has great time depth, not thousands of years. Does apartheid or does something that fragmented have to be somehow a bad thing? Is there some way of making it condign? Is there some way of making that more anodyne?
Well, again, you're asking why aren't the Palestinians happy with the status quo? And what's wrong with them if they don't understand how happy they should be? And I think that's a question that only they can answer, and they'll be happy to answer you if you ask it. But certainly, I have traveled throughout the West Bank, and also I had the privilege of spending some time in Gaza. And it's not hard for me, looking at those places, to understand that a collection of miserable huts in the desert is not worth, there's no human being that deserves that deserves what Gaza has become.
What kind of a military then?
I'm going to finish, Mike. I've got a dozen.
It's not a military issue. You know, I don't think very few people in among Palestinians are talking about wanting to have a very strong military. I don't think that's the issue at all. But I think a decent human life and a chance to improve the condition of themselves and their children is what Palestinians want and what all people are entitled to.
And I would just simply add to this mix. I see a lot of hands, but we're coming into that. We're going to go right over here. But you know, when the Annapolis process began, Daniel was at the beginning and semi-reluctant on this. Said, you know, we've got to be. You know, I support American engagement. You know, Annapolis was the place where essentially James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. At the time of, you know, basically said the effort to try to get a constitution sort of discussion started was a miserable experience, and they said we need to kick this ball down the road and try to do it, and then they called for a convening in Philadelphia. So I thought even Annapolis, you know, bleak chances nonetheless produced a decent result. So we were on board institutionally saying, you know, maybe we could eventually get something, but the results on the Palestinian side from their view is we got about 100 more barriers to movement. A 20% increase under Ehud Barak, Liberal Party leader inside Israel, who said, aha, well now I'm going to, you know, put my finger on the process by trying to sort of, you know, get in the way of what Livni and Olmert were trying to do by increasing barriers to transport, creating greater losses for the quality of life that was already pretty bad on the Palestinian side. So I think in that situation, you know, while we're all calling for greater American engagement to some degree, I think that the bigger issue that Walter is saying, the Copernican shift, is to look at the quality of life of Palestinians, because a lot of the things we've been doing have not been focused on that. And the notion that anyone would want to live in an apartheid situation, go there. I've been there. I've talked to people across the political spectrum, even in the Israeli side, even in Likud, who think that the situation is the status quo is unsustainable. Yes, sir.
Al Richmond, a former opinion analysis in the State Department. Both here and in your article, Walter, it seems that you treat the compensation for refugees, and I should mention, you mentioned Israeli refugees also, but you treat Palestinian refugees' compensation as a transforming event, in which they will develop a stake in enforcing some type of security. One, I want to ask you about your confidence in that relationship and that outcome. And second, do you see it as a longer-term process in which implementation of compensation is actually tied to improvements on the ground from Israelis' point of view, a longer-term process?
I'm going to have to ask for a brief answer.
I think we're talking about a long process, and I think, again, looking for ways to tie the things that Palestinians like in peace to the things that Israelis tie in peace is a way to give both sides a greater stake and greater confidence in peace. So, yes.
The gentleman right in front of the camera.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Initially glancing at your article, I do notice that terrorism is not a term that's used. Was that deliberate on your part? And in the article immediately preceding yours, there's a quote that says, counterterrorism should be an integral part of U.S. Middle East strategy, but it is no longer need be the driver of that policy. Are you in agreement with that?
I don't take responsibility for anything I write other than what I write. So, and not having before me the context, I'm not quite sure what I think of the quote you mentioned. But I certainly, if I didn't mention terrorism, it wasn't because I'm not concerned about terrorism or that I'm not against terrorism. It was just that was not actually the subject that I was directly writing about.
The gentleman right in back, Shah, I'm sorry, yes.
Bob Shadler, American Foreign Policy Council. Thank you for your presentation, and I thought deftly bringing in of the international community was interesting, but looking back, you fault the international community for not providing security for either side, and it seemed looking forward, you look for the international community to provide moral, legal, political, and economic assistance. It seems one of the dilemmas is that a Palestinian state strong enough to provide basic security for the Palestinians is inherently something of a threat to Israel, if not its existence, at least to lots of Israelis. That the equipment, the organization, the personnel, the expertise, all might threaten Israelis. And is there a role for the international community to provide security in going forward?
Thank you, Robert. And I regret for all those people who have their hands up. That's our last question, and this will be our last response from Walter Mead.
Well, look, I think the reason I talked about the failure to protect, the failure to provide security in 1948 was that at the time, legally, Palestine was a mandatory territory that had a special status and in which legally the international community was, in fact, the ultimate responsible party. But the goal now is not to sort of, remandatize Palestine and have and have a new international mandate, but rather the goal is to have two independent states living in peace. Now, and in the conversations that I've had with Israelis and Palestinians, I've never actually heard people say that the issue that you're raising is the difficult issue that's preventing them from moving forward. That the security, certainly the security arrangements between the two states and the right to the Palestinians of security are important issues and need to be addressed. But I have not had the experience from Palestinians even of saying, the Israelis will seem to agree on everything else, but this one we just can't get anywhere on. That probably would not be the issue that would cause the negotiations to fail.
Walter, thank you. I want to thank everyone for a fantastic year. This is the final event of 2008. I think it was a great way to sort of show, we wrestle with ideas, we struggle with issues, we bring in people from a wide variety of perspectives to sort of think this stuff through. And it's a great pleasure to have ended the year with Walter Russell Mead and my colleague Daniel Levy and all of you. I do want to recommend, it's today is this 22nd, 23rd, I can't quite recall. All I know is I've done no shopping yet. I need to, and I already have the God in Gold, but I may go get a few more copies. I also want to plug the president of the New America Foundation, Steve Call, is off in India, allegedly on vacation, but if Steve Call's in India, it's not on vacation. That his book, The Bin Ladens, An Arabian Family in an American Century, as well as a book that I helped trigger, it's called America and the World: Conversations on the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy, with Zbigniew Brzezinski, Brent Scowcroft, and David Ignatius. All three of these books, Walter's book, sort of our book, and Steve Cole's book, were among the Washington Post's favorite for the year. So I highly recommend for any of you who want to stop by Kramer's on the way out, please feel free to pick up your copy. I want to thank our viewers who've been watching live on the Washington Note. And I want to thank all of the people with C-SPAN that are with us, and all of you. Have a great holiday and New Year. Daniel, thank you. Walter, thank you.